Welcome to another show, Research to Rreps. I am your co-host, Dr. Pat Ivey, and with me is Dr. Ted Lambrinides. How you doing, Ted?
I'm doing great, Pat. Looking forward to another great podcast.
Let's do this. Dr. Ernie Reimer is in the house. How are you?
I'm doing good. It's baseball season, so we're at the baseball field every night right now.
It's a beautiful time of the year, isn't it?
It's the best time.
Oh, yeah. So without further ado, we're going to introduce our guest, Dr. Andreas Stamatis. He is an expert in the field of psychology and sport and exercise. I have known him for years. He has been working with the Collegiate Strength and Conditioning Coaches Association, doing research, and I have watched him grow every year, and it's time. The time is now to have him on this podcast. So without further ado, Dr. Stamatis, how are you doing today?
Thank you, doctors, Dr. Ivey, Dr. Reimer, and Dr. Lambrinides. Thank you for having me. I'm doing great. I'm super excited to be on your podcast.
Oh, this is going to be great. So tell our listeners a little bit about yourself, and then we can get nerdy with it.
Okay, all right. So I'm a native of Greece. And I got my bachelor's in Greece. I was always into sports. I got involved into strength and conditioning in Greece in professional teams. I was wanting to come to the States. I came and studied. I went back to Greece. I came back and studied here. My second master's, I went back to Greece. And then finally, at some point, I sold my gym at Greece and I went to Baylor, where I did my last master's and my PhD. My passion is strength and conditioning and sports psychology. I don't know which one is more intriguing to me. That's why I'm doing both. And my journey in sports psychology, and that's the last thing I'm going to say about now, is I started when I was in Greek Special Forces, and I thought I was in a pretty good physical condition. And the first 2 hours I was in, I was like, well, that's not going to make it. There's something else going on here. And I started thinking about the mental game. I didn't know it was called mental toughness or anything like that. And that's how my journey into sports and exercise psych started.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I think a lot of athletes probably hear their experience in your experience, wanting to be at a higher level, but at the same time knowing there's a little bit more that is needed. Dr. Reimer, I know you're a pretty high level baseball player, even currently as we speak. Is this something that where are you with mental health and sports psychology and just professionally, personally?
Well, I've been lucky enough to work with both performance psychologists and mental health professionals since early in my career. I first started working with a colleague who was a performance psychologist in 2004. That's when I really started to be introduced to that. At that time, it was performance psychology. So CMPC at that time. And then as I evolved through my career, I got to work with more mental health professionals. So I've been lucky enough to be exposed to that, to understand that it is a piece of the puzzle, that the stigma of mental health was something that, because of my colleagues, was wiped off of my vocabulary pretty early. And in the past 6 months, though, I have had the opportunity to explore different needs for our athletics department. And we identified pretty early on that mental health and performance is a major need. And that was coming from interactions with coaches and the collective health and performance staff. I would say over the past 6 months, I've learned more about the profession and the needs and truly how to set up a model for mental performance in the athletics department. But I just want to maybe throw this over to you, Dr. Stamatis. In your email, you have a line at the end, and you wrote lift intentionally, not habitually. So what are both the training and psychological ramifications for that statement?
Thank you, Dr. Reimer. So that starts, of course, from psychology, that a specific theory that talks about being intentional, right? And yes, I do end my emails. It's part of my signature, lift intentionally, not habitually, because we have to do with sports. But if I wanted to generalize it, and a lot of times I say that in class, I said, come to class intentionally, lift intentionally, eat intentionally, sleep intentionally, love intentionally. So at the end of the day, live intentionally, have intention in your life, just not be, just have an intention and go after it. So there is, in psychology, there's a strong theory that says once you have the intention, it's a very strong predictor of action. So that's why I am trying to kind of spread the word about trying to being intentional in whatever you're doing, anything. If you want to watch TV, do it intentionally. So I don't know if you are, what you're doing with your athletes and if you're asking them to be intentional. So I don't know if it's something that all of you incorporate in your coaching.
You know, it is something that is growing. I would like to hear from Ted. Ted, you know, at the NFL level, what's being said, or what are the discussions around mental toughness in sport, or coaching behaviors, or strength and conditioning coaching? And these are research areas of Dr. Stamatis. What's happening in the NFL?
You know, I think you know, the term mental toughness or tough coaching, I think sometimes in this era, you know, you've got to figure out if the players can accept that. Do they accept hard coaching? And I think a lot of times with the mental toughness issue is you find that sometimes players, you cannot be mentally tough till you're physically prepared. And Dr. Stamatis sort of mentioned that during his trial in special forces. So I think sometimes you get that over to your athletes, and that is, let's get physically prepared, and then that precedes being mentally prepared. But I think the two go hand in hand. I would be interested to hear, you know, Dr. Stamatis, you know, having a strength and conditioning background, as you progress through your academic training in sports psychology, how did that make you a better strength coach?
Okay, so that's a very good question, obviously. And before I even answer it, I will say, because Dr. Ivey already mentioned it, I've done a lot of research with CSCCA, which is the Collegiate Strength and Conditioning Coaches. And it is more than evident that they do believe in mental toughness. They think it's of value. They think they train it. They think it's something that can be developed. But we have a gap in mostly how to do that and how to measure that, if it's working or not. For me, first of all, is to understand that there is another part of the game that's called mental, which is the mental part of it. And it helps you, and it does go hand in hand with the physical, but the mental will help you go through more physical. And as you're going through more physical, you're going to get higher levels of mental toughness. Of course, that can help the athlete, but also they can help the coach. The coach goes through a lot. It's not an easy job at all. So it helped me go and understand more myself as a human, also as a coach, and then how I can transmit that to my athletes. All coaches, and Dr. Ivey will say that we had a lot of conversations. The majority of coaches, I'm not going to say all, the vast majority of coaches want to have the most mentally tough team, right? So that's what I wanted to. I wanted my team to just go nonstop until the end. No excuses. Do not negotiate with yourself. We said, we're going to do something, we're doing it. Let them quit, we're not quitting, right? But so it helped me kind of to just kind of wrap it up, my answer to that question, to understand what it is, understand that part of it can be developed, and help me find ways to incorporate it into my training as a strength and conditioning coach.
I find that fascinating. I know as a strength and conditioning coach, we want our athletes to be mentally tough. And I believed in it so much that I did go back to school to study that. But I'm fascinated by your path, that you actually were coaching. You knew that the mental side of the game was important, but you went one step further to look at the research, not just look at it, but then participate and grow the body of research around this topic. And there, as far as I know, not too many people that are in this space that you're in. The coaching, the training of athletes, the mental training of athletes, and then the research of the mental and physical side of the game. So how do you process all of this information, everything that's going on that you're involved with? How does it become practical for you?
Okay. I appreciate that question too, Dr. Ivey. So so the reason I went into research was mostly because I had questions, and when I tried to find the answers, there were no answers. So as I was keep researching, I ended up doing the research myself, because there was not a lot out there. I take a lot of pride in being most likely the only individual in the world that systematically researches mental toughness and strength and conditioning. I love strength and conditioning coaches. I think they're undervalued. And I also love mental toughness, so I'm trying to combine that. And as you said, because I was a strength and conditioning coach, and I understand the strength and conditioning coaches, I can speak their language, and they kind of trust me more than, a typical academic. So they opened their weight rooms and like, yeah, you can do some research here. Like they're not feeling that I'm threatening them or I'm an outsider or something like that. So it has put me in a very sweet spot to be able to have one foot in academia and the other foot in the strength and conditioning weight room. And it has helped me tremendously. So I don't know why other coaches, I do know that, but I do know that a lot of coaches read research, right? They don't necessarily love to read as much as we have, because it's part of our profession. But the fact that they trust me and they put me in their weight rooms and they allow me to be the vehicle to go out and try to find evidence to answer their questions, that's amazing. And I'm so grateful for all these coaches. So yeah, thank you for that question. I am in a very sweet spot, and everything started because I was a coach. I understood that there was the mental part of the game, and when I tried to find the answers, I couldn't. So and that's what you did. That's what you did. That's why you went back to school, right? And that's why you're doing what you're doing right now.
What are some of the biggest misconceptions with, trying to develop mental toughness in the athletes? When I talk to young coaches, sometimes getting into the business, they think, you've got to yell at the athlete or somehow, berate them a little bit. And I said, no, that's not part of mental toughness. So, from an academic standpoint, and also from a coaching standpoint, from somebody that's new to the profession, couple teaching points on do's and don'ts of developing mental toughness in an athlete.
Thank you, Dr. Labridis. So one thing that I see as a pattern is that the coaches are using the term, but they don't know what it means per se. So first of all, we need to kind of agree, not 100%, but what it is. What is it? So what exactly are you training? What is that thing? So we have to operationalize it a little bit. Then it just cannot be random. As your physical training is not random, it's part of a periodization, and whatever you're doing during the off season or the in season, it has to be part of a specific program. We also need to understand what is in scope and what's out of scope. So you're not a psychologist. That's great. There are things that you can do and things that you cannot do. One thing that you can definitely do is creating those challenging situations, as we say. But you have to be careful, because if you are in a team sport, different athletes are on different levels. It's the same as physical. You can't say everybody squat 500 pounds. Some may do it, some may do 300 pounds. So you have to, the amount or the duration or the intensity has to go, and you have to meet the athlete. And one very specific thing is, after you take them through whatever you take them through, have the resources to help them recover. So you can't just push them too much psychologically and then just let them be. It's the same as a physical training. If you push them a lot, you have to give them the resources. For example, you have to give them the knowledge. You have to hydrate, you have to sleep well. This is what you need to eat. I'll give you this much more time to recover in terms of between, the practices. So the coaches need, I think that they have to educate themselves first. And for example, after the last CSCCA conference, a lot of coaches reached out to me. And the coaches always ask, what should I do? What should I do? They need the practical tips. They don't want to, but even for a coach, if I come to you and I ask you, oh, you're a strength coach, what should I do tomorrow in order to be as strong as a NFL player? You'll be like, it's not that simple, right? It's kind of the same situation here. It's not that simple, but the very first thing I tell them is educate yourself. And I give them some resources. And I'm like, that is the most important thing that you can do in the very, very beginning. Educate yourself, talk with your team, the other coaches, make sure everybody's on the same page. And then slowly, after you understand what you need to do, try to apply it and see. And I also try to teach them how to measure it. So we do a measurement like before whatever intervention they want to do, and some measurement after, because that's another big thing that I've seen. A lot of coaches will say, yeah, my team is very mentally tough. I'm like, is it? Let's measure it. And we give them questionnaires, and maybe they aren't. Or they think that after their off-season training, which is amazing, they come out tougher. And I'm like, do they? And I've showed some, usually I show the publications that we've done the research, that we measure it, and then they go through the off-season training. We measure again, no significant differences. So that's another thing that we need to figure out. Thank you very much. I don't know about you when you're coaching athletes, or how you define it and how you operationalize it and how you measure it. But that's what I found from the research that I've done.
Ernie, you got a question? I've got another question.
I got a lot of things going through my mind. Some years ago, when you're doing your PhD, you know that not only are you doing research, but you're a research participant in all of your fellow students' research projects. And I participated in some studies that were trying to dissect fatigue, central to spinal cord to peripheral levels. And I did, I had fentanyl injections in my cerebral spinal fluid with EMTs on board. And I think that the effort was around group 3 and group 4 afferents. And for me, I'm a little bit out of date on this research. So I know if more research has been done, but my general understanding is that the group 3 afferents are responsible for sending mechanical deformation of skeletal muscle input to the brain, whereas the group 4 afferents will send information about intramuscular metabolic disturbance. And my assumption, maybe you can clarify if you're familiar with this work or maybe have done some, is that maybe the group 3 and group 4 afferents may actually be the muscle to brain connection that can allow for or provide a physiological explanation for like this so-called mental toughness that could come with intense physical training. Are you familiar with maybe some research in this area that has come out more recently? Because it's been quite some time since I was a participant in studies like that and was looking into it.
You're asking me if there is any physiological explanation of how physical training makes you more mentally tough?
So the speculation, maybe circa 2013, 14, 15, was that with intense training, the brain wouldn't be as sensitive to the group 3 and group 4 afferent signals coming from the muscles. And that could owe to the reduction in inhibition that could be coming from the brain to the muscles. Yes. Because the brain would build up more tolerance to those signals. That was an assumption or something that was being investigated at that time, but I haven't kept up with that research. So I'm curious to know if maybe you've looked into that, or if you've heard in your circle some discussion around that more recently.
Yeah, I don't necessarily look at that specifically. I've heard of that hypothesis. It makes sense to me that you are in a way raising the threshold or decreasing it, however you want to see it. And that affects the way your brain works. I agree, but I don't, research, it depends on your hypothesis of how you're going to design what you're looking for. I'm not doing anything in that perspective, although I'm doing similar stuff, but not necessarily something like that. So I wouldn't be the expert to answer that question.
And I was asking because I've made that claim to sport coaches that maybe that was a possible explanation for why intense physical training can actually allow you to tolerate intense physical training. Because I think all of us have experienced that, right? When you first start doing intense training, you want to quit earlier on, but when you get into better shape, suddenly you can train more intensely than you were before, but you can tolerate more stress for longer periods of time. And I've always just been curious on how that actually relates to what the explanation is for that.
Yeah, I don't research it from the physiological perspective per se. I'm researching it more from the psychological perspective. So for me, for example, you could increase your mental toughness because you, among other things, you increased your self-efficacy. With your self-efficacy, you increase because right now you're squatting 500 pounds, but a year ago you were squatting 400 pounds. So your self-efficacy can go up just by seeing yourself achieving more, right? Or your self-efficacy can go up because your coach this new coach is helping you up more and psyching you up instead of the other coach that was talking you down all the time. So I see it more from that perspective.
That makes sense to me. Ernie, I think what you were saying takes me back to maybe an old school coach that's saying, I'm going to go coach on you real quick. If you want to play in the North Atlantic, you got to train in the North Atlantic. That, those coach, I love those coach quotes or coach isms or whatever. But I think that's what they were trying to get at is if you want to be able to perform well in not optimal conditions, then you have to train in those non-optimal conditions. And I think the question you're asking is from a physiological standpoint, how do you adapt? From a psychological standpoint, how do you adapt? From a physical standpoint, how do you adapt? And how do those different areas influence and impact and affect the other? And I think that's fascinating. I've read a book, and I can't remember the name of it right now, but it basically says the mind has the ability to shape the brain. Like, so how you think can actually shape the physical organ and the neural pathways. So maybe there is something to that. The stress that you endure, the training that you endure, the situations that you go through have an ability to shape these neural pathways in the brain. Dr. Stamatis, what do you think about that?
It does. That's motor behavior. That's the one of the subdisciplines of exercise science. I love motor behavior, and I do believe, the brain pretty much controls everything, whether we like it or not. And yes, of course, some synapses will die, and the more you do, the more you can retain, even as a baby. So definitely, and that's why when you're coaching and when we are talking to coaches, we're telling them design practices that are very similar to the actual game, because you want to train, that's motor behavior. You want to train the athlete in the conditions that can be anything, even wind and humidity and noise and whatever that are in a game situation. So that makes perfect sense. But when we take it to mental toughness, that's all. It's also important to consider the context. So for some sports, it doesn't necessarily mean it's good if you can squat 500 pounds, right? So even in mental toughness, when we're training mental toughness, we're trying to make it context specific. So that's another important aspect that we could potentially talk about. But I agree that through, yes, you definitely develop your brain, and our brains are amazing. Our brains are amazing, and you can see how they fire when they're learning something new, or when you're pushing them through something very difficult. We've done a little bit of research with EEG, and we've seen that mentally tough athletes, when we push them, we have what we call hemispheric specialization. So their theta were higher. So all this is observational. We don't necessarily know why it's happening, but if we can figure out the relationship first, then maybe we can create some interventions that have to do with the brain waves, which that would be super amazing, but that's a long-term goal.
Yeah. For our listeners, you said something earlier, you said self-efficacy. For our listeners, could you give a performance psychologist definition of self-efficacy?
Yeah, the self-efficacy pretty much is your own opinion about your own ability on a specific task. So if we had two twins that had the same physical conditioning right now, and they wanted to run the Boston Marathon, if one of them had a higher level of self-efficacy about their ability, we would say that most likely that person would run a little bit more or a little bit faster than the other one. Self-efficacy is a huge predictor of performance. So that's one of the key dimensions of mental toughness. There are other dimensions that just mentioned that. So self-efficacy has been around for a lot of years, from Albert Bandura. So, and there's a ton of research out there, but in the simplest way possible is that your own opinion about your ability to perform a specific task. And that's why a lot of times what your sibling or your coach or your spouse tells you about yourself affects your performance, because it affects your self-efficacy, right? Sometimes you think you can do it, and sometimes you think you cannot do it. But if you have higher self-efficacy, we know it's a fact that there's a high probability to actually do it.
I've seen some coaches come in, a brand new coaching staff come in and have immediate success. And I don't have the research to back this up, but based on what you just said, it made me think about those situations, because those that came in and fed into their athletes' self-efficacy, whereas the previous staff did not give that much feedback, that much positive feedback, and all of a sudden the same athletes who, pretty much the same team has much more success with a brand new coaching staff over an old coaching staff. But then I've watched that coaching staff become more critical after the first year, and maybe the self-efficacy dropped. It would have been interesting to know that you can measure that, and to be able to go back to a coaching staff and say, hey, coaches, the self-efficacy or the athletes feel good factor about themselves has dropped down a little bit. And then be able to give them some cues, some clues, some ideas. Am I off base with this, Dr. Stamatis?
No, you're exactly right. And it comes back to coaching education, which is the most important thing. And a lot of times it's a little bit challenging to tell a coach that I need to educate you on something because they're the coach, they educate the athletes. So, but you're 100% right. And at least at my institution, I try a lot to educate coaches, and I take it one by one. So one day we may talk about self-efficacy. What is it? How can you increase it? How you can decrease it? All right. What is optimism? How that affects performance? What is mental toughness or resilience or grit or buoyancy or all these things that we know work? What is adversity? How we can face adversity? And if they understand it, I think then they can actually put it into their practices. But you're right. Your coach can definitely affect your level of self-efficacy. It's like, let's say you're doing 20-meter pistol, right? And the coach can see the target and you cannot see it. And they have 2 tries, right? And I hit the first one and it goes 3 centimeters on the left, all right? My coach should know how his or her feedback would affect me and behave accordingly. So if he knows or she knows that if I need the truth will really affect my next shot in a good way today, then they should give me the appropriate feedback. If they feel that it wouldn't, maybe they'll tell me, bullseye, keep going. That was great. Go to the next one. Doesn't matter. So self-efficacy is huge, and in a good way, although I'm going to use the word manipulate, the coach can manipulate information to increase it so we can have better performance in the individual or team sport in a good way. When I say manipulate, I'm not saying it in a bad way, in a negative way. So I don't know if you have any stories like that, but definitely, because the coach we know is the most influential person in the life of any athlete besides their parents. And that's why I insist a lot on the coaching education, because we can do a lot of good stuff through the coaches. And we are doing it, but the more the better. I don't know what's your opinion about that.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, I feel like coaches often, they operate like they're almost like the CEO, and we have all these support services in health and performance, whether that be psychology or nutrition or strength conditioning, sports medicine, science. And no matter how strong their efforts are to have a positive influence on the overall health, injury mitigation, performance of the team, the coach has to be a part of that conversation, because they have the greatest influence on the overall management of the team and the athletes, in my opinion. And I don't know, you could get a megaphone out and talk about this, how important it is to make the coaches a part of the solution, whatever those may be.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I've seen that, the more you try to understand something, the more you realize how much you don't know. But I've seen the new coaches and the older coaches, when they reach out to me and they have that thirst to learn more and serve their students in a better way, that makes me extremely happy. We're all learning all day, right? That's all we're doing. I never say I know everything, and I will never say that. That would be very, very ignorant. But if I can help just even 1% or 2% a coach do better work with their athletes, that makes me extremely happy. That makes my day. And in mental toughness, one thing I want to mention is there's a lot of misconception, and we kind of touched that. And 4 or 5 days ago, I gave an interview to Sports Illustrated. So they called me and they said, we want to talk about mental toughness and how some coaches use it. And during that interview, I realized that they were trying to put a negative aspect on it. And I was trying to explain what it is and how we can use it in a very positive way. And I said, yeah, some coaches may do something and call it mental toughness. Is it? I don't know. How many are these coaches? And with Dr. Ivey, he knows, we've talked about that in conferences about how media love a good bad story because they love the negativity to sell that. Mental toughness is a resource that has to do with positive psychology. And positive psychology is just what it is, it's positive. Mental toughness is some skills that we can teach somebody to have to face adversity as they're trying to reach their goals, right? And it's very proactive. And that's what I'm trying to do with the coaches that I'm working and the athletes. We're trying to develop those skills before something happens. That's how it's called positive psychology, being proactive than reactive, because things will happen. Life is, you plan it as much as you want, but that's not how it's going to go down. So yes, there is negative side in mental toughness, as it is in everything. And I gave that example when I gave that interview. I said, isn't there a bad side on optimism? And the journalist said, what do you mean? I said, well, isn't it bad if you have too much of it? So for example, think about a pilot, right? Don't you have to do some work before you start flying the plane? Like, yeah. So you do all this pre-flight check, right? And then you're like, okay, I'm optimistic. We're gonna have a great flight. You can't just jump on the plane and just leave and just be like, I'll be optimistic. We don't have gas, but I really think I'm really optimistic we can do it. So even optimism has a negative side, right? Without the work, just optimism is dangerous or could be dangerous. So the same with mental toughness. And that goes back to talking with the coaches and the athletes that it's just a tool. You just need to understand what it is and how to use it. And I don't know if you want to go there during this podcast, but there is now the number one topic is mental toughness. So that's that mental toughness and its correlation with mental health, right? So that's why a lot of people are putting a bad rap on mental toughness. They think that has to do with, the mental health issues and all the things we've seen. So that is a new, interesting topic, unfortunately, that we need to talk about, and is mental health in sports, and especially collegiate sports.
I think I would like to go there, Dr. Stamatis, and talk about mental health and mental performance and mental toughness and the stigmas that are attached to that. And why would mental toughness have any negative connotations to it? Why would, and what about, and how does that intersect with mental health? So what are your thoughts on that? I would like for you to dive a little bit deeper.
Yeah, thank you. Well, you talked about stigma, and Dr. Reiner talked about stigma when we started this podcast. So I'm going to come to that in a little bit. The negative side that we do know, the dark side of mental toughness, even if before we go to mental health, is that you can have too much of it. And because you may have too much of it, we know that these are the athletes that sometimes get injured because they never stop. They have that machismo mentality, the hero mentality, and they just keep going until they can't anymore, right? And also we know that it affects rehabilitation. those are the athletes that are like, coach, put me in, I'm ready. I'm like, no, you're not ready. And like, no, I'm ready. And they start early and then they probably get re-injured. So it's something that you need to control as a coach. So if it's too high, you need to understand that and try to bring it down. Like, so the more is not always the better. That's one. With mental health now, they think, and people may think that, you know, if you push athletes too much, you may bring them to a point that they have, let's say, suicidal ideation. What we do know is that mental toughness and mental health are positively correlated, which means the more mental toughness you have, the higher mental health you have as well. So what we have as researchers is pretty much the opposite of some, you know, reports that you see on media. Now, one more thing I want to mention for sure is that goes back to stigma. Mental toughness training is a great way to do mental health training just by its name. When I tell an athlete, let's do a mental toughness training, they're way more receptive because there's no stigma to it. Although pretty much we're doing mental health training because the mental health will be affected as well. So that's another great point that I wanna just bring into the conversation, that because it doesn't have the stigma, it helps us with some kind of interventions that will have to do with athletes that have really low mental toughness and mental health. I don't know if you've seen it with your athletes, or that there is some kind of correlation between mental toughness and mental health.
Oh, I agree with it. Yeah.
Yeah,
It's, you know, resiliency training, and just like you're training the muscles to endure the demands of your sport and training, you got to train the mind the same way to endure the demands of competition and training. And no, I think you're right on point.
Yeah.
I have a question.
Yes, go ahead.
So since we're talking about this idea that if you have a higher degree of mental toughness, then it's causatively correlated with higher mental health and well-being. Earlier, you said that self-efficacy is one component of mental toughness. You mentioned optimism. Mm-hmm. So can we dissect mental toughness into its further traits? Because you mentioned there were other traits.
Yeah, it's a very good question. So I'll start by saying that the scientific community there's no consensus 100% on what it is. It's a kind of, it started with the 1950s. It's been very popular the past 2 decades. So the definition has become better. And we are in a position to know for the most part what it is, and for the most part what it isn't, because that's another thing. We need to differentiate. I already heard the term resilience. We'll have to differentiate from resilience and grit and all this kind of stuff that are similar-ish. So one of the most popular definitions is about, first of all, the conceptualization is called unidimensional. So those key dimensions that we're going to talk about right now assimilate over time and create mental toughness, right? One, as we said, it was self-efficacy. The other one is a success mindset. The third one is the knowledge of the context. The fourth one is buoyancy. And buoyancy for us, because it's a word that most people are not using it every day per se, unless you're a diver, is what we call everyday resilience. Optimistic style. Number 5, overcoming adversity. Number 6, attention regulation and emotion regulation. Those are the 8 key dimensions of mental toughness. And I'm more than happy to talk about any if you want.
I love it, because I guess, and maybe you can put this down to someone else, but when you hear that, it almost just sounds like a challenge to myself as a professional and the way I interact with my colleagues and athletes, but as well as all the other coaches out there who are working with their athletes and training their athletes to develop mental toughness. How much do we as coaches and practitioners truly know about these 8 dimensions if we are truly trying to help our athletes develop greater mental toughness? Because I could go into asking you to define the rest of those, just like I asked you to define self-efficacy, but I'll say right here now that I need to do more I need to do more research, and I need more personal education and growth in each of these areas to truly understand this concept. And that's definitely one thing you've done for me in this conversation.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Reimer. In general, we know what we know, and you know more about your specialty, and I know more about my specialty. And of course, the coach knows what the coach knows, right? There is a problem here because the coach really believes in it, but it's sports psych, so it's out of scope in a way. So it's not their fault that when they went through school or whatever certification they have, they didn't necessarily took them through this kind of information, right? But we have a gap there, but also have a huge desire to create the most mentally tough team. And that's where we can say, well, yes, I agree with you, but let's break it down, let's understand it, and then let's design something based on your understanding. So I agree 100% for you. And I'm not trying here to say anything bad about the coaches. I love them. The only thing I'm trying to say that through education, they can be better. That's all, if they want to. That's it.
I'm glad you stated earlier that this is difficult to define. And the scientific community have not come to consensus. And that's what I learned. I learned that mental toughness itself is a construct, and it's hard to define. But while we were working with coaches, we also had to acknowledge that they do know what it looks like. They may not know how to develop it. They may not know how to, if it is decreasing, like we talked about earlier, if self-efficacy is decreasing, they may not know how to stop and reverse it because they may not understand the impact of their actions at that point in time. But I think as we continue to build the teams around coaches, and as we continue to have more experts at the table that are a part of the conversation, these CEOs, like Dr. Reimer mentioned earlier, that just like a CEO of a company may not know every aspect that's happening in their company, but they are at the table and they know to have the right people at the table, and they know how to empower them to communicate and to speak up, and for the CEO to be able to listen. And I think that's what we can really, that's a message we can really push to these CEOs is we have some experts that you need to have at your table. They need to have a voice at that table, be working with others at that table to provide to be the best resource possible. So that when we're talking about something that can be measured by specialists and experts, can be brought in, that information can be brought into the conversation. Just like, how much did this athlete weigh today? Or did they eat breakfast? What is their GPA in class? What is their self-efficacy score at this point in time? What is their RPE score at this point in time? This information and data can be part of the conversation, which is going to help everyone. And it is going to, you want to know how to improve mental health? We've been talking about it this entire podcast. So I'll stop right there, Dr. Stamatis. I want to hear your feedback to my comments there.
I agree 100%. We all agree that the interdisciplinary approach is the way to go. right? And I'm sure all coaches have meetings where, you know, the sport coach is there and the strength and conditioning coach may be there, or maybe two strength and conditioning coaches, and maybe the RD is there. But there needs to be somebody and talk about the psyche and the psychological part as well. And then whoever is in charge about that decision, they have all the information they need to make the most educated decision. That's it. Because there's, as you said, there's a part that is not clear, and we're making decisions without knowing. So yes, maybe I pushed somebody too much today, but I didn't know there was something going on. I didn't know. So again, I'm not trying to say anything about the coaches. They're doing their best, and their job is so challenging. There's so many variables, and we're living in a world there's so much data. But from that data, we must get the information we need to make the best decisions for our athletes. So we can measure self-efficacy, we can measure optimism, we can measure attention regulation, we can measure emotion regulation, and we can share that information with the rest of the team and help the athletes in whatever goals they have, performance, injury rehabilitation, whatever they're going through. But again, I agree with you, the interdisciplinary approach is super important. I don't know if you want me to say anything else or you want me to cover something, but I'm open to anything.
I think Ted had a question.
Yeah. How do you deal with the athlete that's like a perfectionist and they're very hard on themselves?
Perfectionism is, again, something that can be measured. And there are ways to measure that. And there's ways to, it's not as simple as to just cover it right now, but it's something that's measurable. And if you are, especially, we wouldn't measure just that. There are other resources that usually they come with high perfectionism, and we should see if they're high in all three or in all five. And then we take a step and work. What I wanted to say, and thank you for that question, is that whether you want to work on perfectionism or self-efficacy that we talked about a lot today, or mental toughness, it's the same thing as you are. Let's say you want to work on your mile time. It's not one time and you're ready. Because a lot of times we hear the coach, hey, go talk to him or her and come back. Just, you know, and then, okay, they will come to me and they will tell me something. And then what am I supposed to do in one session? Like, we're just going to know each other. So these things take time. And because some problems that we may find have taken a lot of time. So I'm not specializing in perfectionism per se, but it is correlated with mental toughness a lot of times. The higher really levels, we see them. And again, if what I would do if I would see an athlete of mine was getting hurt by really high levels of perfectionism, I'll sit down, I let them talk, identify the issue. If it's an issue that I have to take them off and they can't play, I'll take them off and we'll work on it and then put them back. If it's something I work as they're playing and it's not in the red, it's like in the yellow or the orange area, then we break it down. And there's a lot of homework and skills that you can teach them, and slowly you take them from the office to the practice and from the practice to the field.
Ernie?
Well, these conversations always go by super quick, and I know we can probably go on for a lot longer, but Ted, I know you always have a magic question that you like to ask, but I do have a question for everyone real quick. So at least, you know, I do know that I have more work to do to learn about these other dimensions of mental toughness, but I do perceive that we have a room full of people who have fairly strong degrees of mental toughness for the things that we do in our lives. But I'd like to go around the room in 30 seconds and just ask each person Like if there's one thing that you do in your life that you feel you have a high degree of self-efficacy. Let's start with you, Dr. Ted.
Oh, I would say one thing I do is make it a habit of every day trying to learn something new. So I'm either doing literature reviews or, reading articles that you've written, or now I know I'm going to read some more from Dr. Stamatis. So that will lead to my increase in self-efficacy.
Yeah, I would say I make my bed, I brush my teeth. I'm a little more simple than Dr. Ted there. I make my bowl of oatmeal. I take my vitamins and take a shower. And when I do those things, I feel better about myself. I know that I have reviewed my schedule for the day, and I know that I'm organized and ready. And if I can start my day like that, I know I have a better chance. I feel better about myself. I know I can accomplish my goals for the day. And I also know that if it doesn't work out like that, I'm going to figure it out. I'm going to figure out a way to still override my routine and find a way.
I guess it's my turn. I think I'm pretty good with being patient. That's what I think. I have high self-efficacy. Although two of you that talked before me, what I heard is more about having a solid routine. And I wanted to make a comment about that. Routines keep us sane. So keep trying to find your routine and keep it alive, because that's a very important part. But one thing that Dr. Ivey said, I want to make a short comment before I go. Dr. Reimer, and he will tell us what he thinks he has high levels of self-efficacy is that it's great that he can adapt when things don't go the way he thought, because we know that people who are super proactive, sometimes they may have trouble adjusting because they just get really frustrated when the things don't go the way they wanted them to go, because they've done all this prep work, and it's just, they can function in a little bit in when it goes off whatever they plan. So kudos to you.
Nice. Well, I think one thing that helps me for sure is that sometimes I have short-term memory loss, meaning that I just kind of get caught up in the moment that I'm in, and am usually pretty optimistic and positive about the current task at hand, just being present and where my feet are. I feel like I have a strong degree of self-efficacy and facing new problems and challenges and finding a solution when at first I don't even know where to begin, and just being able to take the first step forward toward a solution. I feel pretty strong in my ability to do that. We started this podcast with baseball season. I would also say that I feel like I'm going to step into the batter's box tonight in my 40+ baseball division and just have a really good night.
Good. And you will. You will.
Before we finish up here, we always ask our guests to recommend some books to our listeners, either ones you've written or ones you would recommend.
All right. Does it have to be books? Okay. Let me see.
No, if there's interesting articles that would serve the purpose as well.
I'm pulling my books right now. I have them on my phone. I have some pretty good. I just don't want to. All right, what I've read lately and I really liked, I've read, it's the second actually time that I'm reading it. It's a philosophy book. It's called Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. I don't know if you've read that. It's the second time I'm reading it, and it feels like it's the first one, because sometimes you read the same book and you are on a different phase of your life and you understand so much more, or it just hits you differently. I've also read one for time management, and I find it really useful in this era that everything goes fast, and you don't have time for everything. It's called 4,000 Weeks, Time Management for Mortals. And it gives you an idea of how you can manage your time. And that he tells you in the very beginning that, you know, you only have 4,000 weeks. That's it, 4,000 weeks. So what are you going to do with it? And I'll give you one more, pretty easy read, but really useful, I think. It's called The Compound Effect. The Compound Effect. And it talks a little bit about how you can bring more success in your life, in your profession, just by moving little by little every day.
Very nice. Dr. Stamatis, thank you for your time. Where can our listeners and viewers find you?
Can they find?
Yes, so social media, or what's the best way to reach out to you?
All my profiles, social media, are professional. I don't have any personal profiles. So I'm on Facebook as Andreas Stamatis. I'm on Instagram, the same thing. LinkedIn. I read a lot. I write a lot. I'm sorry, on Medium, which is a platform that I'm trying to break down concepts like mental toughness and what it is by sharing stories. And it's easier for people to read them and understand maybe a little bit more complex psychological definitions and all these kind of theories and stuff like that. Yeah, YouTube, the same thing, Andreas Stamatis. And my email, it's coach_stam@rocketmail.com. So if anybody would like to reach out, I'd be more than happy to talk. And I've kept my coach email intentionally because I never want to forget that I was a coach. I still want to feel as a coach. I still do feel as a coach. So that's my email address.
Thank you so much.
For having me.
Yeah,
I really appreciate it. It was great. I wanted to do this, and I'm happy I had the chance to talk with all of you. I was super great. Thank you.
This has been a great conversation. Thank you so much. Good night and take care.
Thank you, everyone.
All right. Thank you.
Take care.